In the center of a city where wealth and luxury defined the rules, there was a cafe, a place where status was everything, and the unwritten law was simple. Only those who could afford to blend in had a right to exist here. A place for the elite to sip overpriced coffee and pretend that the outside world, the real world, didn't exist. Jason, a man in tattered clothes, entered the cafe. His face told the story of a life lived on the streets. Weathered, scarred, and worn, but in his eyes there was a flicker of something more. The cafe fell silent as he stepped inside. Patrons dressed in their fine suits shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, glancing at each other. Jason's presence was a disruption. He walked slowly toward the counter, scanning the menu with quiet determination. The world he had entered was not meant for someone like him. He wasn't looking for trouble, just a glass of water. But in this place, a humble request was an offense. A simple human need broke the fragile rules that kept the elite in their world. The waitress behind the counter gave him a forced smile, one that said, "I see you, but I wish I didn't." She turned and signaled to someone out of his sight. A few moments later, the manager appeared, silently gesturing for Jason to leave. He hesitated, but without protest, he turned and walked out, as quietly as he had entered. The door closing behind him felt like a final punctuation to the moment. He knew they would remember him, the man they had turned away, the man who would never forget. Years passed, but the memory of that day lingered. Jason, no longer the broken man, sat at a desk in a small, dimly lit room, tracing the edges of a business card he had once left behind at the cafe. Jason R. Evans. The name was simple, but it carried something powerful, something Jason had built from nothing. He picked up the phone and made a call with confidence. Deals were made. The world that had cast him aside was now in his sights. The cafe, where he had been humiliated, would soon belong to him. While the cafe continued to serve his patrons, blissfully unaware, Jason had been building, strategizing, and planning. The man they had discarded was on his way to owning everything they held dear. Years later, Jason entered the cafe, no longer ragged and broken, but with confidence and purpose. The patrons didn't recognize him. They couldn't. How could they? The man they had discarded was now the one they had to answer to. Jason stood near the counter, watching the familiar faces work. The unease behind their smiles was palpable, but they still didn't know who he was. That day, Jason's mind shifted. The rejection from the cafe had been the final push he needed. But just as things started to fall into place, disaster struck. A phone call from his accountant informed him that his investments had collapsed. Everything he had worked for was gone, but Jason didn't give up. With no money left, he found another job at a small repair shop. He worked harder than ever, and little by little, his savings grew. With newfound caution, he invested in small opportunities. Jason was determined to rebuild. After years of hard work, Jason was driving a brand new car. His business ventures had started to pay off. As he drove one afternoon, he noticed a flyer stuck to his car's windshield. It read, "Shop for sale." The address was familiar. It was the Café Royale. The memories of that day flooded back. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. Jason entered the cafe, now worn down, a shadow of its former self. He saw potential. This was his chance to turn it around. With the money he had earned, he purchased the cafe and transformed it into a thriving business. It was no longer just a cafe, it was his dream made real. Jason stood behind the counter, watching the cafe bustle with customers. It now welcomed everyone, no matter their status. A sign on the wall read, "Anyone who can't afford to pay is on the house." It was no longer a symbol of rejection, but a place of opportunity and second chances. Jason had written his own story. From homelessness to riches, from despair to triumph, he had risen after every fall. And now that story would be shared with anyone who walked through the door.